I used to be a tour guide in a popular tourist town in Tennessee. My job at the time was to take people on a circuitous 2-mile walk around the town, telling them the ghost stories of the people who had lived there. During the summer, tours started a little before sundown and would end well after dark. All in all, it would take us roughly 1 to 2 hours to get through a tour, depending on the walking speed of my group. Just to preface this, the majority of stories we told were not true. They were either largely exaggerated, entirely fabricated, or simply gruesome stories of local murders with a paranormal twist added at the end, with the ghost of the killer still lurking about. I didn't write the script, don't blame me. In fact, I visited a local museum and sourced authentic ghost stories from a curator in order to add a few of my own to the tour, which were actually authentic. That said, there were a handful of times during my stint as a tour guide in which I had experiences that were not so easily explained. In this post, I'm going to detail 3 of the most interesting ones. Story 1. One of the tools we got for our tours were EMF detectors, which I'm sure you're mostly all familiar with. They're intended to scan for electromagnetic frequencies and will detect the relative strength of a signal they pick up. Now, just because one of these things goes off doesn't mean you're seeing a ghost. They also pick up power lines and will go off like crazy near a generator. But if you're in the middle of nowhere and you suddenly get a strong signal, it's worth looking into. Now, these detectors we used had about 5 lights on them, changing in hue from green to yellow to red. Red meant no signal, and green indicates a strong signal. The light never goes below red unless you turn the thing off. That's the baseline. At the end of our tour, we would come to an old graveyard, nobody buried in there in at least 100 years. After I did my thing with the final story, people would wander around and look at the graves with flashlights and scare themselves shitless. But one night, as they were wandering, a man came over to see one of the graves. I went over and had a look, and I saw what the problem was. Whenever he passed his EMF director over this particular grave, all the lights would turn off. The entire machine would turn itself off when it was over the grave and turn back on as soon as you moved it away. We tried with a couple other graves, but only this one had the effect. We were curious about this grave, so we tried to read the name of the person, but the headstone was too worn down for us to read it. The first name, Thomas, was faintly able to be read, but the surname was too hard to read. We had the whole group, 5 people, leaning over it at this point, trying to read it, when we all heard the same thing. As one of the group wondered aloud what the man's surname was, a loud voice from behind us shouted,
Whaley.
As you may have guessed, there was nobody behind us when we turned around, and we called the tour to a close shortly after that. I never messed with that specific grave again, except to place some flowers on it one time, as it was my habit every once in a while, since nobody visited that place anymore. Story 2. At the end of the tour, sometimes I would get tips if people had fun, got spooked. Older boomer and Gen X men really enjoy the charade of the covert handshake tip, where they palm you the money as they shake your hand. I always indulged a bit because, hey, I was getting a tip. One tour I ran had a family of 3, mother, father, daughter, and an older man who I initially thought was Grandpa, but later learned had been lumped into their group because we didn't run solo tours. The old guy was pretty quiet throughout the tour, but would occasionally ask very pointed questions that stood out to me as odd. I don't remember most of his questions anymore. This was years ago. But one example is that I was telling a story of a girl who fell from a balcony, and her ghost haunts the river she plummeted in to this day. And he asked me if I thought she died right away when she hit the ground, or whether I thought she died slow and suffered. Just weird things like that. Well, at the end of the tour, the family took off into the graves to have a look about, see if ghosts would show up in their pictures, etc. Old man comes to give me that typical handshake, and mentally, I was thinking that all his weird behavior could be easily forgotten if he tipped well. The handshake was normal, except that his hand was ice cold. But old folks have cold hands, so I didn't think about it too much. Except, he didn't palm me $1, he palmed me a coin. I thought it was a $50 when I felt it at first, but it was too big. I turned to glance at the guy as he walked past me to leave, and I shit you not, he was just gone. The path leaving the graveyard was downhill, and you had visibility from the top for at least 300 feet. There was no way he could have covered that distance in that time, and I didn't even hear running. Just this old, tottering man in front of me 1 second, and gone in the blink of an eye when he walked past me. When I got home, and I looked up the coin, 1 troy ounce silver bullion, minted to an older year. I don't remember exactly. I can check the year when I get home this evening, if anyone cares. Overall, the experience left me a little shocked, and the family agreed. He was really odd when I walked them back to their car. Apparently, the guy greeted their daughter by name when they arrived at the meetup spot a few minutes before me, but they had no idea who he was. Story 3. So 2 weird experiences, but no ghostly apparitions or demonic screams. Unfortunately, most nights on the ghost tour were entirely mundane. However, I have got one more odd story I experienced, which really set my belief of ghosts in stone. One of the earlier stops in our town was an old cabin where the town's progenitor once lived. The cabin has been moved around a couple of times to build parking garages, but has since been placed back in its original spot. We don't actually have a photo of the woman who founded the town, but we've got pictures of her granddaughter, who everyone at the time swore was a dead ringer for her grandmother. Because of this, an old black and white photo of her granddaughter is on the sign outside of the cabin. The cabin is kept locked with a padlock at all times, except when the Historical Society opens it for school groups. The windows are so dirty you can't see inside, and most of the time it's too dark to get a decent look inside. Anyway, regardless, I like to encourage people to peek through the cracks in the old wood, because they'd psych themselves into thinking they saw something move, and a spooky tour is a tour with good tips. Anyway, one night after I did the whole spiel about her founding the town, and how people say they can see her ghost within the cabin on some nights to this day, I let them all have a go at peeking inside. One of the younger teens in the group approached me after looking inside, and we had a very odd conversation. These kids, 13 to 16, usually think it makes them look cool to be skeptical and show everyone they're not scared. So he asked me something like, "Who's in the costume?" I was a little confused and explained how the photo on the sign is a picture of the granddaughter of the town's founder, but that she wasn't wearing a costume. That was how people dressed at the time. The little shit rolled his eyes and told me he meant the woman in the cabin. Of course, I had to have a look, so I peeked through, and sure enough, a streetlight was shining through the dirty windows and letting in a diffused sort of light, and you could just make out a figure in a rocking chair sitting in the corner of the dark cabin, rocking back and forth. It was hard to get a good look at her, but from what I saw, she did look just like the woman in the photo. I moved the group on pretty fast because, quite frankly, I was a little afraid it was a homeless person who'd broken in somehow. If it was, I had a group of 6 kids and 1 parent, homeschoolers, I think. I didn't want anybody getting hurt or snatched, but I stopped by the cabin again on the way to my car, and the lock was on tight and undamaged. I peeked in again, and there wasn't even a rocking chair in the cabin. In the whole time I worked the tour route, roughly 2 years, I never saw a chair in that cabin again, or any old woman, for that matter. So anyways, those are my stories. I know they aren't as sensational as some, but I thought I'd share my experiences with you all. I have a few more odd stories that I can share if you'd like, but they're all more explainable by mundane means, if not still creepy and odd. I've had a few paranormal experiences in my life, but this is probably the weirdest of the bunch. I'm in my early 40s now, but when this happened, I was 14, and it was the summer of 1995. It was in the late afternoon, around 4 p.m., and still very light. I was stood near the back door in the kitchen of my mom and dad's house. My dog was stood in front of me, and I had just put some scraps from my tea in his bowl. Suddenly, he lowered his head, bared his teeth, his hackles stood up, and he growled. He was a wire-haired fox terrier Jack Russell cross, but he was not food protective and was usually very placid and mild, so this was very unusual behavior for him. I stood up straight and noticed my shadow on the wall near the door getting darker until it was so beyond black it was devoid of color. I realized my dog was not protecting his food. He was scared. The shadow then stepped away from the wall as a fully 3D being and was only feet away from me. My dog ran away, but I was frozen with fear. Back then, I was around 5'4", and this thing was the same height as me. It had no facial features and a smooth outline. It had shape and form, but at the same time was so dark that it seemed like a void. It had no eyes that I could see, but I got a sense that it was looking at me. This being and I stood and stared at each other for what felt like 5 minutes, but really must have been mere seconds. I was terrified, and it seemed shocked that I could see it. It then raised its arms up, so its hands were above its head. Then it shot up into the ceiling, into a puff of smoke, the same color as the being. The smoke dissipated as soon as it had appeared, and I could move again. I had no idea what I'd seen, as I'd never heard of anything like a living shadow. Also, I didn't know anyone who had seen something like that. At the time, the internet wasn't what it is now, and we didn't even have a computer to access it anyway. I spent many years worrying that I had some kind of mental illness or something. Then, years later, I found a website where other people had written about their experiences with these shadow people. In the past 10 years, I've heard a lot of people talking about them on various podcasts. I don't know what they are, and I'm not going to pretend that I do. All I know is, I saw something that I don't understand. Other people in my family have seen the shadow person, but only in glimpses. I have seen another since, at a friend's house, and though creepy in comparison, that one was nowhere near as scary. I'm an avid believer in the paranormal, but if I wasn't, this building would have done it for me. I used to work in a pretty standard pub, small English town, lots of local regulars, nothing out of the ordinary. But after a while, the staff started to tell me stories. I learned it was an old Victorian house, with a family living upstairs, a woman living where the bar was, and that the cellar had once been a doctor's surgery. The deepest room in the cellar was used as a laundry room, but it had always made me extremely uneasy. I was told that this is where the old surgery was, and that there was a ghost in the cellar that didn't like women in there. They said the only way to protect yourself was to tell the ghost that you had the right to be there. I also heard that the woman who died in the bar was still there. I was uneasy, but I kept working. Nothing happened until I'd been there a few months. The first big experience. I was in the pub alone before a shift. I'd gone down to the cellar to collect bottles of drinks to refill the fridges upstairs. I then decided to go deeper into the cellar to get clean towels. On my way out, the lights cut. I heard the laundry door slam behind me and footsteps coming up behind me. They sounded so heavy, like a man. I heard heavy breathing, and I swear my heart was pounding. As soon as the footsteps stopped, the lights came on. There was nobody there, but I ran. I ran upstairs, bolted the door. I had the worst feeling. When my colleagues turned up, they said I was shaking. I remember just praying and refusing to go back downstairs. The second experience. I was in the bar with my colleague when a woman walked up to the bar. We were serving other customers, so she was in our periphery. She very clearly asked us if we could please help her. We said yes, just to wait a minute please, and she said that she'd be waiting. She walked out of the bar and into the adjoining concert room. Once I'd finished serving, we went into that room to see what she wanted. She was gone. What made it weird? That room had no other exits. She walked in and vanished. We checked the CCTV, and there was no sign, but we had both seen her. It shook me up, but unlike the first encounter in the cellar, I didn't feel scared. I felt sad. It was like she was a residual spirit, lost and lonely. I hope she managed to find peace. The third experience. This one was the second negative experience. Every area in the building had a telephone in it. The idea being that we could just call each room, as it was a huge building. The only phone that was broken was the one in the cellar because it never worked, and my boss just didn't see the point in replacing it. Nobody really used the phones anyway. I'd finished up for the day and had gone upstairs to the office. I was collecting my bags when the internal phone in the office rang. I was very surprised because there was nobody else in the building. I went to check the screen to see where the person was calling from. They were calling from the cellar phone, the only one that had been broken for years. I frantically texted the other staff. They confirmed nobody was there. I answered the phone. Nobody spoke, so I hung up. The second I did, they started calling again. I had that awful, uneasy feeling from the cellar ghost again. I grabbed my things and got the hell out. I told my boss the next day, and she checked the cellar, confirmed that the phone was still out of use. I felt really sick. That place had so many little spooky things. Doors closing, bar shutters rattling, things moving around, snooker balls rolling on their own, curtains twitching, but none of that stuck with me like these three experiences. The second one just made me sad, but the encounters in that cellar made me feel sick. I used to dread going down there. I'd feel upset and emotional every time I left the cellar, and would only feel safe if I prayed or if I crossed myself. I have no idea what was living down there, but it couldn't have been good. I was thrilled when I got to quit that job.